September 11th, 1999, London, Marsham Street. At precisely 9:30 in the morning, archivists from the British Home Office present a red-bound volume across a briefing table, the Mitrokin Archive, Volume 1. Inside the declassified KGB files stands a single operational designation, Agent Hola. The marginal notation records a statistic that contradicts every British security assumption of the Cold War era. Operational span from 1937 to 1972, with over 850 documents transferred and zero operational compromise. For 4 decades, while Britain expanded its nuclear program by over 600% and developed one of Europe's most advanced reactor materials industries, the KGB maintained an unbroken intelligence channel into the scientific infrastructure supporting it. The question emerges immediately. How did a clerical employee at a modest research institute evade every MI5 review, every security reform, and every Cold War counterintelligence sweep for more than 40 years? The story begins in 1937, when Britain's scientific establishment expanded rapidly under the direction of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. Laboratories working on metallurgy, alloys, and reactor materials operated under minimal security oversight, reflecting pre-war administrative norms that treated industrial science as fundamentally separate from national security concerns. The assumption was straightforward and nearly universal across Whitehall's administrative departments. Metallurgical research posed no strategic risk to British interests. Industrial science served commercial purposes, supporting manufacturing efficiency and product development. Academic laboratories published findings openly in peer-reviewed journals. Government coordination focused on efficiency and innovation rather than secrecy or compartmentalization. Moscow thought otherwise. Soviet intelligence officers operating from the NKVD Residentura in London identified Britain's metallurgical research infrastructure as strategically significant years before British security officials recognized its potential. Sensitivity to national defense. The reasoning was both technical and forward-looking, anticipating developments that would only become obvious to Western planners years later. Metallurgical science would prove foundational for reactor engineering in ways that weren't yet apparent in the late 1930s. Alloy composition would determine radiation resistance in reactor components. Corrosion testing would predict structural integrity under extreme conditions never before encountered in industrial applications. Material selection would influence cooling system efficiency and fuel rod performance in nuclear reactors that existed only in theoretical physics papers. In 1937, Melita Norwood joined the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association as a secretary, a position that appeared entirely routine within the administrative structure of British industrial research organizations. The BNFMRA occupied modest facilities in London and provided specialized research services for government ministries and defense industries across multiple sectors. The institution's work portfolio included high-strength alloys for aircraft components, corrosion-resistant metals for naval applications, and specialized materials that would later prove essential to early nuclear reactor design. Her position appeared entirely routine to hiring managers and colleagues. Filing cabinets stood unlocked throughout normal office hours. Draft reports circulated between departments without classification markings or distribution restrictions. Metallurgists compiled detailed test results on copper-zinc alloys and distributed them across departments without requiring authorization or supervisory approval. Unknown to her employers and colleagues, Norwood had already been recruited by the NKVD through contacts with the Communist Party of Great Britain. Her political convictions formed during the 1930s, shaped by economic depression, rising fascism across Europe, and ideological attraction to Soviet communism as an alternative to capitalist democracy. The recruitment follows standard NKVD practice for ideologically motivated assets: gradual cultivation through political organizations, careful assessment of access and reliability, then operational tasking once trustworthiness was established. Her benign clerical role granted continuous access to internal correspondence, draft reports, and laboratory summaries that circulated in unlocked filing rooms throughout the BNFMRA's facilities. Documents that appeared entirely routine to British administrators contained foundational data on Britain's developing materials science expertise. By early 1938, Soviet analysts in Moscow referenced BNFMRA data in internal technical assessments. The intelligence appeared in directorate reports evaluating Western industrial capabilities. MI5 did not yet know the Institute handled materials relevant to national security. When Britain's tube alloys program began in 1940, the scale of nuclear research documentation grew exponentially across government, scientific institutions, and contractor facilities. Initial project files numbered just 17 pages of preliminary feasibility assessments and theoretical considerations about whether uranium fission could produce practical weapons. By 1942, that figure exceeded 300 pages of detailed technical specifications, experimental protocols, procurement requirements, and engineering blueprints. Tube alloys represented Britain's code name for its atomic bomb project, initiated after refugee physicists demonstrated that uranium fission could produce weapons of unprecedented destructive power, fundamentally changing the strategic calculations of modern warfare. The program operated under extreme secrecy at primary research facilities where weapons design occurred. Scientists working directly on bomb physics faced intensive security vetting procedures. Laboratories handling fissile materials implemented strict access controls and compartmentalized information flows to prevent comprehensive knowledge from residing with any single individual. Intelligence officers monitored personnel with direct knowledge of bomb design principles. The security architecture reflected contemporary understanding of nuclear weapons development. Protection focused primarily on theoretical physicists, weapons designers, and facilities handling enriched uranium or plutonium. When tube alloys merged into the joint Anglo-American effort that later produced the Manhattan Project, Britain's technical reports became even more sensitive within the Allied intelligence framework. The Quebec Agreement of 1943 formalized scientific cooperation between Britain and the United States, creating protocols for information sharing and personnel exchange. British physicists traveled to Los Alamos to contribute to American bomb design efforts. American engineers consulted on British reactor designs intended for plutonium production. The bilateral relationship created new security protocols governing information sharing and personnel access across national boundaries. The BNF-MRA fed nuclear materials research indirectly into tube alloys through government contracts and procurement channels that appeared entirely legitimate within Britain's wartime industrial mobilization framework. Sir John Anderson, who headed Britain's atomic effort as Chancellor of the Exchequer and chair of key scientific advisory committees, directed substantial funding toward metallurgical research on reactor-grade materials. Nuclear reactors required specialized alloys capable of withstanding intense neutron radiation, extreme temperatures exceeding anything in conventional industrial applications, and corrosive cooling fluids circulating through radioactive environments. Britain possessed limited expertise in these highly specialized materials. The BNF-MRA held contracts to develop and test them through systematic experimental programs. Those contracts flowed through standard government procurement procedures that created no security alerts. Research requirements arrived in internal memoranda using technical language but without classification markings. Laboratory results returned through institutional correspondence, following normal administrative channels. Progress reports circulated among administrators before reaching technical review committees for scientific evaluation. The reports flowed directly through Norwood's desk as part of her routine secretarial responsibilities. Her access inadvertently expanded precisely when the strategic value of materials intelligence reached its wartime peak, as Britain accelerated reactor development to produce plutonium for weapons and establish post-war nuclear capabilities independent of American control. Between 1943 and 1946, MI5 headquarters operated under a security model developed during the interwar period and adapted only incrementally for wartime conditions and emerging nuclear threats. Intelligence officers screened only 62 high-risk scientists nationwide during this absolutely critical period of nuclear weapons development, when Britain's program expanded rapidly and coordination with American efforts intensified. The selection criteria reflected conventional assumptions about espionage threats derived from earlier cases, focused scrutiny on individuals with direct access to classified weapon designs, foreign nationals working in sensitive positions, and academics with known left-wing political affiliations or suspicious foreign contacts. The underlying assumption was clear and appeared entirely reasonable given pre-nuclear espionage patterns. Ideological filtering would work effectively at the scientist level, preventing communist sympathizers from accessing sensitive positions. Soviet intelligence would logically target physicists who understood bomb theory and could explain it to Moscow, chemists working on explosive lenses who knew how to trigger fission reactions, and engineers with knowledge of weapon assembly who understood how components fit together. Recruitment would occur among credentialed scientists whose advanced expertise enabled them to comprehend and communicate highly classified technical information to handlers who lacked scientific training themselves. MI5 expected standard vetting procedures to catch foreign nationals whose loyalties might be divided, prominent scientists with suspicious contacts abroad, and individuals with direct access to weapon designs or fissile materials. The screening protocols emphasized academic background checks, examining university political activities, political affiliation, reviews looking for Communist Party membership, and surveillance of scientists attending international conferences or maintaining correspondence with colleagues in neutral countries that might serve as intermediaries for Soviet intelligence. Roger Hollis, who later rose to Director General of MI5, worked in counterintelligence during this period and helped establish vetting priorities that emphasized scientific credentials as the primary indicator of espionage risk, requiring intensive investigation. Norwood fit absolutely none of these priority categories that consumed MI5's limited investigative resources. She was British-born with no foreign connections that appeared in routine background checks conducted on government employees. She held a clerical position processing administrative correspondence rather than conducting scientific research or accessing experimental data directly. She worked at an institution that handled materials research rather than weapons assembly, theoretical physics, or uranium enrichment. Her daily responsibilities involved typing, filing, and document circulation tasks that seemed entirely removed from sensitive nuclear information. To MI5 officers applying standard risk assessment criteria developed from previous espionage cases, she represented zero espionage threat worthy of investigation or even cursory attention. The 1950 Parliamentary Security Review later documented these fundamental failures with damning statistical precision. Less than 5% of BNFMRA's annual expenditures went to security measures during the crucial 1940s period, compared to over 20% in defense-linked physics laboratories working directly on weapons design at facilities like Harwell. The budgetary allocation reflected institutional classification within government systems. The BNFMRA was categorized as civilian industrial research, despite its extensive contracts supporting nuclear weapons development. Administrative staff bypassed all security filters designed exclusively for scientific personnel with advanced degrees and research responsibilities. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union established Directorate S within its reorganized intelligence structure, dedicated specifically to scientific and technical collection across all fields relevant to Soviet industrial and military development priorities. The unit operated from Moscow headquarters, with regional sections coordinating operations in Western Europe, North America, and other target areas where advanced research occurred. Directorate S processed over 18,000 pages of Western scientific data yearly through extensive networks of agents, technical collection platforms, and academic exchange programs that concealed intelligence gathering behind facades of legitimate scientific cooperation. The volume reflected Stalin's determination that the Soviet Union would match Western technological capabilities regardless of cost. Moscow expected significant gaps in Western reactor metallurgy based on pre-war Soviet assumptions about capitalist industrial secrecy practices and competitive research dynamics. Soviet planners anticipated that Western corporations and government laboratories would compartmentalize information jealously, limiting comprehensive intelligence collection. Different companies would protect proprietary processes. Universities would withhold findings until publication. National laboratories would classify results. Norwood's material systematically closed those anticipated gaps. Her access provided not isolated technical reports on specific experiments, but continuous, comprehensive coverage of Britain's metallurgical research infrastructure over years, enabling Soviet analysts to track program evolution longitudinally. identify emerging technical challenges, and monitor how British scientists solved shared problems. Between 1946 and 1950, Soviet officers Alexander Feklisov and Nikolai Apollonov coordinated scientific intelligence operations from Moscow headquarters, managing agent networks and evaluating incoming technical intelligence. Feklisov had previously operated in New York during the Manhattan Project era, running several scientific and technical sources, including some who provided valuable atomic intelligence. His operational experience informed Directorate S protocols for evaluating source reliability and assessing technical intelligence value. Apollonov specialized in metallurgical intelligence, specifically maintaining sufficient personal expertise in materials science to assess the quality and strategic significance of metallurgy reporting from agents operating in Western countries. KGB Report S-112-49, declassified decades after the Cold War ended, documented detailed internal Soviet assessments of Western materials science during this crucial period when Soviet reactor programs struggled with materials challenges. The report systematically analyzed British advances in reactor cladding materials, compared Western and Soviet approaches to high-temperature alloy development in oxidizing environments, and identified specific technical areas where Soviet programs lagged significantly behind Western research, despite substantial resource investment. Norwood's intelligence appeared throughout the classified analysis as primary source material directly informing Soviet understanding of British capabilities, methodologies, and solutions to shared technical problems that Soviet engineers faced in their own reactor development programs. Declassified KGB files indicate explicitly that Norwood was considered one of the most important scientific assets operating anywhere in Britain during this formative period of nuclear competition. Soviet assessments claimed her material helped identify critical bottlenecks in Western production methods, revealing constraints that limited British reactor construction timelines and suggesting where Soviet programs might achieve advantages. The intelligence guided early Soviet choices in reactor cladding materials, informing high-level decisions about which metals to prioritize in expensive experimental programs requiring scarce resources. Information on beryllium usage and advanced metal purification procedures accelerated Soviet materials development significantly by reducing wasteful research redundancy. Soviet internal memos ranked Norwood's material above contributions from several trained physicists who had been recruited separately through parallel networks targeting scientific personnel. The reason was operational continuity rather than credential-based technical expertise or depth of scientific understanding. Scientists moved between projects as funding priorities shifted and programs evolved through phases. Individual scientists possessed deep specialized knowledge within narrow technical domains, but lacked breadth. Norwood remained stationary at a single institution with uninterrupted access to comprehensive research output spanning multiple materials science disciplines over decades. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, Britain built its first operational nuclear reactors at Harwell Atomic Energy Research Establishment in Oxfordshire, marking the nation's transition from theoretical nuclear physics to practical engineering implementation and operational experience. GLEEP, the graphite low-energy experimental pile, achieved criticality in August 1947, becoming Britain's first functioning nuclear reactor and demonstrating that controlled fission reactions could be sustained safely. The facility operated at relatively low power levels for pure research purposes, testing various fuel configurations and measuring neutron behavior in graphite-moderated systems to validate theoretical predictions. BEPO, the British Experimental Pile 0, followed in July 1948 with significantly higher performance specifications, achieving a neutron flux exceeding 10 to the 12th neutrons per square centimeter per second, and producing useful quantities of radioactive isotopes for research and medical applications. These reactors represented Britain's critical transition from theoretical physics calculations to practical engineering challenges requiring solutions to problems that had never before existed in human industry. Construction required solving numerous material science challenges that had absolutely no precedent in conventional engineering practice or industrial experience. Reactor cores operated at extreme temperatures approaching 1,000 degrees Celsius, while simultaneously exposed to intense neutron radiation that progressively degraded metal structures over time through atomic displacement and induced radioactivity. Cooling systems demanded corrosion-resistant materials capable of maintaining structural integrity while circulating fluids through intensely radioactive environments without developing leaks that would release contamination. Fuel cladding required specialized metals that could contain highly toxic fission products while simultaneously allowing efficient heat transfer without undergoing chemical interaction with uranium fuel elements that would compromise reactor safety. Harwell procurement officers coordinated extensively with BNF MRA metallurgists on reactor steel fatigue tests and uranium alloy samples during this intensive construction phase when deadlines were aggressive and technical challenges. Mounted. The collaboration followed entirely standard government contracting procedures that raised no security concerns. Harwell engineers identified specific materials requirements based on reactor design specifications and operating parameters. BNF MRA researchers conducted highly specialized testing that Harwell facilities were not equipped to perform in-house, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that the BNF MRA had developed for industrial clients. Results returned through institutional correspondence and formal technical reports submitted to fulfill contract obligations and justify continued funding. The UK Atomic Energy Authority assumed confidently that technical data leaks were highly improbable at auxiliary research facilities based on risk assessments that emphasized direct access to nuclear weapons designs or fissile materials as the primary security concerns requiring intensive protection. BNF MRA drafts remained completely uncategorized within MI5's document classification system because the reports described materials testing procedures and experimental results rather than reactor designs themselves or operational parameters that might reveal weapons program details. Security protocols carefully distinguished between information about the reactors themselves and their operating characteristics, which received high classification levels, and information about materials used in reactor construction components, which often circulated with minimal restrictions because it seemed like ordinary metallurgy. At least 14 Harwell-related documents entered KGB archives without ever touching MI5 review processes, according to post-Cold War analysis of the Mitrokin material, carefully cross-referenced with surviving BNF MRA records and Harwell procurement documentation. These documents detailed materials testing results for reactor-grade metals, comprehensive alloy composition analyses showing precise element ratios, and detailed procurement specifications that informed Soviet understanding of British reactor engineering approaches and design philosophies. The documents were not classified within BNF MRA's internal administrative system because they described contractor testing work rather than Harwell reactor operations directly. That seemingly minor administrative distinction created the exploitable vulnerability that Soviet intelligence leveraged for years. Between 1951 and 1956, MI5 faced its most significant Cold War crisis, fundamentally reshaping British counterintelligence priorities and consuming virtually all available investigative resources across the organization. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos and later at Harwell on British reactor designs, was exposed as a Soviet agent in January 1950 after American codebreakers identified him through Venona decrypts. His detailed confession revealed that he had systematically provided comprehensive information on atomic bomb design to the Soviet Union throughout the 1940s, significantly accelerating Soviet weapons development. Guy Burgess and Donald McLean defected dramatically to Moscow in May 1951 after counterintelligence investigations began closing in on their activities as long-term Soviet agents. Both had held senior positions in the Foreign Office with extensive access to classified diplomatic correspondence and intelligence assessments. After the devastating Fuchs case demonstrated catastrophic security failures, MI5 opened over 300 new investigations targeting individuals in scientific positions, academic institutions, and government departments with access to sensitive information. The investigative surge reflected profound institutional recognition that Soviet intelligence had achieved dangerously significant penetration of Britain's most sensitive programs despite years of security efforts. Substantial resources flowed toward identifying additional compromised scientists and officials who might be working for Moscow. Surveillance teams monitored suspects around the clock. Phone taps recorded conversations for linguistic analysis. Mail intercepts systematically examined correspondence patterns for coded communications. Background investigations painstakingly examined educational histories, political affiliations during university years, travel records to communist countries, and personal associations with known communist or suspicious contacts. The investigative focus centered almost entirely on physicists, mathematicians, and individuals with direct access to weapon designs or highly classified diplomatic intelligence that could compromise Western strategy. Scientific espionage was logically expected among credentialed scientists capable of understanding and accurately communicating highly technical information about nuclear weapons physics to intelligence officers who lacked scientific training themselves. The Fuchs case powerfully reinforced that fundamental assumption. A physicist with truly comprehensive knowledge of bomb design had caused immense damage to Western nuclear security by providing the Soviet Union with information that likely shortened their weapons development timeline by years. MI5's institutional response logically concentrated intensive efforts on preventing similar penetrations among remaining scientists with equivalent access and advanced expertise in weapons-relevant fields. Declassified MI5 indices from the period show truly intensive surveillance of academic institutions, particularly Cambridge and Oxford universities, where Burgess, McLean, and other suspected Soviet agents had originally been recruited during the turbulent 1930s when communist ideology attracted idealistic students. National laboratories faced enhanced security reviews with new vetting procedures. Defense contractors handling classified research underwent systematic vetting audits, examining their personnel security practices. The counterintelligence response was substantial in scale, sophisticated in methodology, and entirely focused on the specific types of positions and institutions where known major breaches had actually occurred. The BNFMRA did not appear anywhere on priority investigation lists compiled by MI5 analysts. The institution handled materials research rather than weapons design work that could directly compromise bomb secrets. Its employees were technical support staff and industrial scientists rather than theoretical physicists with deep understanding of nuclear weapon physics. The organization maintained absolutely no formal security clearance requirements because its work was officially categorized as civilian industrial research despite extensive government contracts supporting nuclear programs. From MI5's perspective, applying hard-learned lessons from recent devastating espionage cases, the BNFMRA represented absolutely minimal risk compared to universities and weapons laboratories. During Britain's largest and most intensive counterintelligence push of the entire Cold War era, Norwood actually delivered her highest volume of classified notes to Soviet handlers operating in London. The operational tempo increased significantly, precisely when MI5 was most intensively focused on scientific espionage threats, but looking in entirely the wrong places based on perfectly reasonable assumptions derived logically from recent painful cases. Between 1951 and 1956, MI5 conducted thorough background investigations on over 400 individuals connected directly to Britain's nuclear weapons program at major facilities. Norwood was not among them. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, KGB operational records documented zero compromised transmissions for Agent Hola over more than 2 full decades of continuous operation, a perfect security record that was truly extraordinary within Soviet intelligence operations of the period. Most long-running agent networks experienced at least occasional disruptions through defections of handlers or couriers, surveillance detection by hostile counterintelligence, courier compromise at handoff points, or communications intercepts by signals intelligence. Operational reports filed by successive KGB handlers consistently documented complete operational continuity for the Hola operation without any security incidents, close calls, or periods of enforced inactivity to avoid suspected surveillance. Soviet intelligence headquarters expected occasional disruption as statistically inevitable in long-term operations spanning decades through changing political circumstances. Handlers rotated between postings, creating transition risks. Couriers faced constant surveillance risks in London, where MI5 maintained active counterintelligence operations. Communications methods had to evolve continuously to counter improving Western technical collection capabilities, including enhanced photographic surveillance and sophisticated phone tapping. Political pressures fluctuated as East-West relations cycled through crisis and détente. Despite all these operational variables that typically created problems, KGB reports showed absolutely perfect continuity for Agent Hola across changing conditions. Between 1957 and 1963, Norwood provided increasingly valuable material on sodium-cooled reactor material tests and beryllium purity assessments as Britain's nuclear program matured substantially from experimental reactors to commercial power generation and advanced weapons production. The reactor designs evolved considerably from experimental piles, proving basic concepts, to sophisticated power-producing facilities connected to electrical grids and generating revenue. Materials requirements became progressively more demanding as designers pushed operating temperatures higher to improve efficiency and as radiation exposure intensified with longer fuel cycles. The BNFMRA's research portfolio expanded correspondingly, addressing new technical challenges in reactor materials that commercial power generation and weapons production introduced. The Mitrokhin archive entries, compiled meticulously from KGB internal files that Vasily Mitrokhin transcribed in secret during his years working in the Soviet intelligence archives, recorded a formal recommendation for commendation issued to Agent Hola during this productive period. Such official recognition from Moscow Center was genuinely rare for non-scientist assets within the KGB's Scientific Technical Directorate organizational structure. The Directorate naturally valued technical expertise highly, typically reserving formal commendations for agents with advanced scientific credentials who could provide expert technical analysis alongside raw documents, helping Moscow understand significance and applications. The recommendation cited reliability and operational continuity rather than technical sophistication or dramatic intelligence coups. KGB assessments explicitly valued sustained access over spectacular, occasional high-level breaches that created security risks. Scientific intelligence collection required longitudinal coverage extending over years to effectively track program evolution, understand how methodology development occurred through iterative experiments, and identify precisely how Western scientists solve difficult technical problems through systematic research programs. Norwood provided exactly that kind of continuous, comprehensive reporting that enables strategic analysis impossible from sporadic reporting. Her operational security remained elementary throughout decades of espionage, but proved consistently effective against British counterintelligence efforts. She worked entirely alone without accomplices who might compromise the operation through careless tradecraft or wavering ideological commitment. Courier handoffs occurred in public spaces using standard recognition signals and extremely brief exchanges that minimized exposure time and surveillance opportunities. Material was systematically photographed using compact cameras rather than physically removed from offices, leaving absolutely no inventory gaps in BNFMRA filing systems that might trigger administrative inquiries or security reviews. The tradecraft techniques were entirely standard, taught in basic KGB operational training, but their sustained effectiveness depended fundamentally on institutional vulnerabilities in British security remaining completely unaddressed for decades. British counterintelligence reforms arrived in waves throughout the 1960s in direct response to the Cambridge 5 scandal and related espionage cases that had embarrassed British intelligence. Post-Cambridge 5 security audits increased by over 40% across government scientific institutions, according to MI5 budget allocations and personnel assignment records. The reforms systematically targeted recruitment vulnerabilities at universities, substantially enhanced vetting protocols for positions requiring security clearances, and greatly expanded counterintelligence liaison relationships with academic institutions conducting government-funded research that might attract Soviet attention. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War files. By 1964, MI5 leadership confidently believed the major structural vulnerabilities in Britain's scientific security architecture had been systematically identified and addressed through more than a decade of intensive, expensive reform efforts following the Fuchs and Cambridge 5 scandals. UK government departmental audits from the late 1960s documented genuinely comprehensive security improvements at national laboratories, nuclear facilities, and defense research establishments across the country. Document classification systems became substantially more rigorous with clear marking requirements and distribution controls. Personnel vetting programs expanded dramatically in both scope and frequency, with periodic reinvestigations replacing one-time hiring checks. Counterintelligence liaison protocols significantly improved coordination and information sharing between MI5 and institutions conducting sensitive research. Physical security received substantial capital investment, including perimeter fencing, guard forces, and access control systems. Document control procedures tightened administrative restrictions on classified material circulation through new regulations and oversight mechanisms. The institutional confidence was not at all unreasonable or unjustified given the observable improvements. Britain had systematically implemented security reforms that matched or, in some areas, exceeded contemporary NATO standards for protecting nuclear weapons information and defense research from hostile intelligence services. American counterintelligence officials regularly consulted with British counterparts on best practices and lessons learned from cases. International security conferences facilitated sharing of methods across allied nations facing common Soviet intelligence threats. The comprehensive security architecture that emerged from this sustained reform effort represented genuinely sophisticated institutional learning from painful early Cold War penetrations that had damaged national security. The reformed security system would almost certainly have prevented another Klaus Fuchs from accessing weapons design information undetected for years. Substantially enhanced vetting procedures with periodic reinvestigation would very likely have detected another McLean or Burgess before they could achieve sensitive positions and operate for extended periods. Background investigations now systematically examine political affiliations far more thoroughly than interwar procedures had. Periodic reinvestigations specifically monitored cleared personnel continuously for behavioral warning signs of potential compromise, including financial problems, excessive drinking, or suspicious contacts. The security system had genuinely adapted to counter the specific threats it had painfully experienced through devastating breaches. However, the BNF-MRA's strategic relevance to nuclear programs declined substantially and naturally during precisely this same period of security reform, ultimately rendering the belated reforms essentially irrelevant to the institution's long-standing actual vulnerability. Britain's reactor programs matured significantly between the late 1950s and early 1970s as experience accumulated. Experimental reactors designed primarily for research gave way to commercial power stations optimized for electricity generation and economic operation. Research focus shifted noticeably from fundamental material science questions to operational efficiency optimization and cost reduction for competitive power generation. Cutting-edge materials research progressively moved to purpose-built facilities with integrated security designed into their operations from inception, rather than organizations retrofitted onto institutions with deeply ingrained pre-war administrative cultures resistant to security restrictions. The BNF-MRA's institutional role in supporting nuclear research diminished considerably as programs consolidated at purpose-built secure facilities specifically designed for classified work. By 1968, the specific types of materials data flowing routinely through the BNF-MRA's research programs no longer matched the KGB's highest priority intelligence requirements as closely or as comprehensively as they had during the critical 1940s and 50s when Soviet programs desperately needed Western technical information. Soviet reactor programs had matured substantially and independently through sustained indigenous research investment. Moscow's materials science capabilities had systematically closed many technical gaps that Western intelligence assessments had identified in earlier comparative analyses. The specific technical problems Soviet engineers faced evolved considerably beyond the foundational materials challenges, where British BNF-MRA research had provided maximum intelligence value. Intelligence collection requirements naturally shifted toward different technical domains, where Soviet programs still lagged demonstrably behind Western capabilities, and where intelligence could provide greatest marginal advantage. By 1972, KGB handlers and Moscow Center analysts mutually assessed that continued operational risk no longer justified the marginal intelligence gains from maintaining the HOLA operation. The operational relationship concluded quietly after 35 years of continuous espionage activity. No exposure occurred that triggered investigation. No suspicion was raised among British security officials. No counterintelligence investigation was ever initiated. The operation simply ended by mutual Soviet assessment that institutional changes and technical program evolution had effectively eliminated the specific access that had originally made Agent HOLA so valuable for so long. The revelation came not during the Cold War itself, when it might have prompted immediate counterintelligence action, but rather 2 decades after détente began easing tensions, and several years after the Soviet Union collapsed entirely, eliminating the strategic context that had motivated the original espionage. In 1992, former KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the West with one of the most comprehensive intelligence archives ever successfully exfiltrated from Soviet custody. He brought with him approximately 25,000 pages of handwritten notes, meticulously documenting Soviet intelligence operations spanning 6 full decades, across literally every continent where the KGB had operated agent networks or conducted active measures operations. Mitrokhin had spent 12 extraordinarily productive years secretly transcribing KGB operational files while working in the archive's Foreign Intelligence Directorate at Yasenevo headquarters outside Moscow in an apparently routine position. His official position provided legitimate daily access to voluminous historical operational files being systematically transferred from aging central filing systems to newly constructed archive facilities with improved environmental controls. The massive transfer process created temporary but significant vulnerability in document security as files moved between locations. Mitrokhin methodically exploited that vulnerability, systematically copying operational details into small notebooks that were inconspicuous enough to conceal during his daily commute without attracting security attention from guards or colleagues. British Secret Intelligence Service officers extracted the massive archive material through Riga following initial contact in the Baltic states during the chaotic period immediately following Soviet dissolution when security controls weakened. The defection process took many months of careful operational planning to execute safely. Mitrokhin's material represented an intelligence windfall of absolutely unprecedented scope and detail. SIS coordinated extensively with CIA throughout the process to thoroughly evaluate the archive's authenticity and assess its strategic significance for Western intelligence. Both agencies assessed the material as genuinely authentic based on numerous internal technical details that corresponded precisely with known operations and distinctive technical indicators of authentic Soviet filing systems that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. SIS transport securely moved the entire archive from Latvia to London for systematic, detailed analysis by specialist teams with extensive expertise in Soviet intelligence operations, Cold War history, and sophisticated counterintelligence methodology. The sheer logistical challenge was substantial and unprecedented. 25,000 pages of handwritten notes required systematic organization into usable categories, professional translation where necessary from Russian technical terminology, careful cross-referencing with existing Western intelligence holdings to identify overlaps and contradictions, and thorough analytical assessment to determine which revelations required immediate urgent counterintelligence action versus primarily historical interest for understanding past operations. Western intelligence analysts initially expected significant revelations from the Mitrokhin material based on its unprecedented scope, but reasonably anticipated findings would primarily involve operations already partially known or at least suspected through previous defector reporting and signals intelligence collection. Cold War archives typically confirmed existing suspicions and filled in operational details rather than revealing completely unknown major penetrations. The Mitrokhin material fundamentally contradicted that reasonable expectation. Page after page documented major operations that Western counterintelligence services had never detected despite decades of intensive efforts, agents who had never faced investigation or even casual scrutiny, and significant intelligence losses that security services had never recognized occurred or affected their programs. Among thousands of detailed operational entries, one particular codename appeared repeatedly across multiple distinct chronological sections and thematic files: Agent HOLA. The comprehensive files documented activities spanning 4 full decades, including specific dates when material was transferred to handlers, detailed descriptions of courier procedures and recognition signals, and summary assessments of the strategic value of specific documents delivered. The entries lacked a true name as standard KGB security practice. Western analysts faced a significant reconstruction challenge. They possessed extraordinarily detailed operational history spanning 35 years, but absolutely no definitive identification of the actual individual who had conducted this remarkably successful espionage. Between 1997 and 1998, MI5 research units at Thames House headquarters initiated systematic cross-referencing analysis to identify Agent Hola from the extensive operational details preserved in the Mitrokhin archive. The analytical methodology required painstakingly correlating decades-old institutional records with specific KGB courier dates and detailed document descriptions. Analysts faced substantial technical and practical challenges throughout the investigation. Many crucial institutional archives from the 1930s and 40s had been destroyed through routine disposal, damaged in wartime bombing, or inadequately preserved in substandard storage conditions. Essential personnel records required physical retrieval from multiple scattered archive facilities across the country. Historical document distribution lists needed careful reconstruction from fragmentary surviving sources that were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. The analytical team systematically digitized surviving BNF-MRA distribution lists from the 1940s through 1970s, where original records had been preserved in retrievable condition. The British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association appeared prominently and repeatedly throughout Mitrokhin's detailed transcriptions as the primary institutional source for much of Agent Hola's most valuable material over decades. The organization matched critical operational parameters derived from Mitrokhin's notes. It conducted relevant metallurgical research, held substantial government contracts directly supporting nuclear programs, and maintained relatively loose document security throughout the entire period in question. The BNF-MRA logically became the primary institutional focus for intensive identification efforts. Analysts meticulously aligned available personnel records with specific KGB courier dates, extracted from Mitrokhin's notes with extreme precision. The sophisticated correlation analysis systematically searched for individuals who appeared on document circulation paths, matching every single KGB transmission date recorded in the archive across 35 years. The statistical challenge was genuinely substantial and complex. The BNF-MRA employed dozens of staff members over the 35-year operational period. Many employees had relatively brief tenures, lasting only a few years. Some had access to only specific, narrowly defined research areas. The rigorous analysis required identifying someone with continuous, uninterrupted employment throughout the entire extraordinary period and simultaneous access to all diverse document categories that appeared in detailed KGB assessments. MI5's detailed analytic memos documented the methodology with great precision for future reference and potential legal proceedings. The agency systematically cross-referenced 35 complete years of BNF-MRA employment records against 87 specific dates when Mitrokhin's notes explicitly indicated Agent Hola delivered material to Soviet handlers in London. The search parameters were necessarily extremely precise to narrow potential candidates effectively. Continuous employment from the late 1930s through early 1970s without significant gaps, documented access to both metallurgical and nuclear materials research across multiple distinct technical disciplines, and verified presence on internal distribution lists for documents precisely matching KGB descriptions of Hola material in assessment reports. Computer-assisted correlation analysis processed thousands of personnel records, distribution lists, and courier dates to systematically identify statistical overlap patterns. Modern investigative techniques applied to historical data enabled comprehensive systematic reconstruction that would have been practically impossible during the Cold War with manual analysis methods. One name appeared consistently on every single circulation path, matching KGB dates documented throughout the Mitrokhin material: Melita Norwood. Her employment record showed absolutely continuous tenure from 1937 until her retirement in the 1970s. Her position as secretary granted routine administrative access to all document categories the KGB specifically described receiving. Her secretarial responsibilities explicitly included document circulation, systematic filing, and routine reproduction for distribution. The statistical correlation was not merely strong, but effectively perfect, beyond reasonable coincidence. Every single documented KGB courier date corresponded precisely to a period when Norwood had verified documented access to relevant materials. Absolutely no gaps existed in her employment record during operational periods when transfers occurred. No other BNF MRA employee in the entire organizational history showed remotely comparable access breadth and employment duration. Additional investigation systematically confirmed supporting details. Norwood had documented connections to the Communist Party of Great Britain during the 1930s. Her political beliefs remained remarkably consistent throughout her entire life, without the evolution many contemporaries experienced. By late 1998, MI5 had reconstructed Agent Hola's identity with sufficient confidence to brief the Home Office. When Home Office officials interviewed Norwood in 1999, she was 87 years old, living quietly in suburban London, in the same modest house where she had resided for decades. The approach was cautious and carefully planned. Legal prosecution faced very substantial obstacles, including strict statute of limitations issues, severe evidentiary challenges in proving specific offenses from the 1940s and 50s, and serious questions about whether prosecution of an elderly woman for Cold War espionage served any meaningful contemporary public interest. The interview sought acknowledgement and whatever additional information she might provide, rather than building a formal prosecution case for trial. Norwood acknowledged providing material to Soviet intelligence during the interview without significant resistance or denial. Her formal statement, recorded in official Home Office press briefings issued when the government decided public disclosure was necessary for transparency, maintained she acted from deeply held ideological conviction rather than financial motivation or coercion. She believed the Soviet Union deserved access to nuclear technology to balance Western power and prevent an American monopoly on atomic weapons that might enable nuclear blackmail. Her justification reflected political beliefs formed in the 1930s during the rise of fascism and sustained essentially without apparent modification through the entire Cold War and beyond into the post-Soviet era. The acknowledgement created immediate, intense political and media attention across Britain. The public expected espionage at the scientist level based on prominent Cold War cases involving physicists like Fuchs and weapons designers with advanced technical knowledge. Norwood's exposure contradicted those deeply ingrained expectations fundamentally. She was not a physicist who understood reactor theory or bomb design principles. She was not an engineer who worked on weapons assembly. She was a secretary who managed routine document circulation at an industrial research organization. The breach was purely administrative rather than technical or scientific. Britain confronted the longest unbroken scientific intelligence breach in its Cold War history, executed by someone who never held a security clearance because her administrative position was never deemed sensitive enough to require vetting. The revelation forced painful reassessment of fundamental assumptions about where espionage vulnerabilities existed. Intelligence professionals had focused intensive efforts on protecting direct access to classified information. The actual breach involved unclassified administrative processes that controlled classified information flows indirectly through supporting institutions. Mitrokhin panel findings emphasized the organizational gap. BNF MRA document management practices showed minimal evolution in security procedures. Internal files moved through unstaffed areas. Photocopying required no authorization. Administrative staff operated without background investigations. The contrast between MI5's assumptions and reality was absolute. British security doctrine had focused on preventing ideologically motivated scientists from accessing classified research. The actual breach involved an ideologue with access to unclassified administrative processes. The government ultimately decided against prosecution. The Official Secrets Act's statute of limitations had expired for most relevant time periods. The decision was controversial, but reflected practical legal realities. Parliamentary reports compiled between 1999 and 2001 systematically documented the systemic failures that the Norwood case revealed in Britain's Cold War security architecture. The Intelligence and Security Committee, Parliament's statutory oversight body for intelligence and security services, conducted comprehensive review of vetting procedures, institutional security protocols, and counterintelligence practices throughout the nuclear program's entire history. The ISC identified over 400 British scientific and industrial organizations that had operated during the Cold War with grossly inadequate vetting procedures for personnel handling potentially sensitive information through contracts or research relationships. Britain had confidently expected that tight security controls effectively protected nuclear secrets throughout the Cold War period despite occasional breaches. Post-exposure investigations revealed that actual oversight had been seriously decentralized, frustratingly inconsistent, and based fundamentally on pre-war administrative assumptions that never adequately adapted to Cold War intelligence threats despite periodic reform efforts following major scandals. Security protocols vary dramatically between superficially similar institutions based primarily on administrative classifications that often failed completely to reflect actual strategic sensitivity of research. Organizations officially designated as defense facilities received comprehensive security oversight with substantial resources, supporting contractors and research institutions classified administratively as civilian entities operated under minimal restrictions. The ISC report on legacy vulnerabilities explicitly cited Agent Hola as primary justification for implementing comprehensive reforms addressing institutional gaps rather than focusing narrowly on individual failures or personal NFA betrayals. The case demonstrated conclusively that espionage could succeed systematically through administrative access at supporting institutions, even when primary facilities maintain objectively excellent security meeting all established standards. Document circulation between organizations with different security cultures created critical vulnerabilities that neither individual facility's security protocols adequately addressed. Contract research enabled strategically significant information flow outside secure perimeters without triggering security reviews designed exclusively for classified document handling within controlled facilities. MI5 introduced substantially revised vetting protocols for technical institutions following detailed recommendations from the parliamentary review process. The new comprehensive framework required security oversight for essentially any organization handling materials research, technical analysis, or scientific services with any potential dual-use applications, regardless of whether the institution held formal defense contracts or conducted overtly classified research directly. Mandatory periodic reviews replaced one-time vetting at initial hiring. Cross-agency liaison protocols significantly improved systematic information sharing between MI5, contract oversight offices, and research institutions. The reforms acknowledged what the Norwood case demonstrated conclusively. Cold War scientific espionage did not require direct access to weapons, laboratories, or classified facilities to inflict strategic damage. It required access to industrial research, supporting weapons development indirectly through material science, component manufacturing, or technical services that seemed routine. Security classifications were revised to account for indirect sensitivity through aggregation. Administrative access received systematic attention. Document circulation required logging. Personnel with document management access underwent background investigations. Implementation extended throughout the early 2000s as institutions adapted procedures. By 2005, revised protocols were substantially implemented across Britain's scientific research infrastructure, representing genuine institutional learning from the Norwood case. Historically, the precise impact of Norwood's espionage remains actively debated among intelligence scholars, Cold War historians, and national security analysts who examine the case from different analytical perspectives. She did not provide nuclear weapons designs to the Soviet Union that enabled them to build bombs they otherwise couldn't. She never accessed Los Alamos data during her espionage career. She never obtained British atomic bomb schematics or detailed weapon specifications. Western intelligence assessments conducted thoroughly after her exposure acknowledge candidly, however, that metallurgical data and production workflows contributed incrementally to Soviet reactor research during the 1940s and early 1950s, when Soviet programs most desperately needed Western technical information. The intelligence value was not in breakthrough revelations, enabling Soviet scientists to solve fundamental problems they could not address independently with sufficient time and resources. Soviet expertise in metallurgy was genuinely substantial, with strong theoretical foundations. What Norwood provided was persistent, comprehensive coverage of British approaches to reactor materials, challenges over decades of continuous reporting. Soviet engineers gained valuable insight into Western methodologies for solving shared technical problems, material selection criteria based on extensive experimental testing, and industrial production constraints that affected British program timelines. Analysts reassessing Cold War intelligence losses in 2003 emphasized strategic context. During the 1940s, the Soviet Union faced significant metallurgical challenges in reactor construction beyond theoretical physics. Norwood's material provided Soviet researchers with detailed Western testing data, enabling them to benchmark programs and identify promising research directions without duplicating costly testing British researchers had already conducted. The comparative information guided resource allocation toward approaches showing most promise. The Mitrokhin archive evaluation concluded with a documented line summarizing her operational significance. Agent Hola served longer and more continuously than any other source in the British scientific community. Norwood lived in suburban London until her death in 2005 at age 93. Security reforms focused on institutional vulnerabilities rather than individual ideology. The lesson was organizational. Security must account for administrative access to sensitive information, not merely direct scientific access. Melita Norwood's case demonstrated that effective intelligence operations often exploited organizational assumptions rather than technical sophistication. She required no advanced tradecraft. She simply had access to documents that circulated without restriction, and she understood their value to Moscow, while British officials did not. Agent Hola served longer and more continuously than any other source in the British scientific community. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War Files.